chances are, if you have been diagnosed with ADHD, you've probably been told at some point in your life that you're too emotional, too sensitive, making a big deal out of nothing. And today, one of the things that I want to talk to you about is why managing big emotions with ADHD is legitimately harder, how those two things are connected, and the strategies and tools that I teach my clients to be able to better regulate their emotions. I'm Dr. Kiara. If this is the first time you're tuning into one of my videos, I'm a licensed psychologist, and this is my YouTube channel In Session, where I give you mental health information that is both accessible, engaging, and accurate. In this video, we're going to talk about three things. What is emotion regulation? Why does ADHD make emotion regulation harder? And then I'm going to explain strategies and techniques that I teach my clients to be able to better cope with their emotions. So first, let's talk about what emotion regulation is. There are many different definitions of emotion regulation, so this is just one that I like. But one way to think about it is that emotion regulation is the ability to influence which emotions we feel, when we feel them, and how we express or experience them. So for example, when someone hurts your feelings, rather than lashing out or shutting down, instead, you take a minute to process what you're feeling, and then you respond in a way that actually aligns with your values and beliefs. So for instance, if you're someone that really values that friendship and you don't want to make things worse with this person, but you also want to communicate that this person hurt you, rather than snapping back and saying something mean back, instead, right, you're able to kind of take a moment to really assess what the best way to respond is. You're able to regulate what is going on in your own body, right, and validate the very real experiences and emotions that are coming up for you without doing something or responding in a way that is only going to make you and the other person potentially feel worse. And one of the things I want to emphasize about emotion regulation is that there are both healthy and not so healthy ways of regulating emotions, right? And even if we engage in an unhealthy way of regulating our emotions, that doesn't mean that it's not helping, right? But potentially in the long term, it may not necessarily serve us. So for example, let's say you're at work and you had a really bad day, and to cope, maybe you go to a bar and you get drunk because that's a way for you to kind of just numb and forget, and it's an easy way for you to kind of just let go of the day. That is emotion regulation. Probably not the best way to regulate your emotions, right? But you are doing something to calm yourself down from the day, right? You're doing something to control the fact that you had a really bad day at work and you want to feel better. And so you go to a bar. However, in therapy, what I'm often doing with people is having them identify what exactly they do to cope with their emotions. What are the triggers? What are the things that make them feel bad? And then how do they then respond to those triggers? What do they do? And is there any room for change, right? Is there any way that we can adjust how they cope? So maybe they're coping in ways that don't do harm long term. So someone with good emotion regulation skills would likely be able to stay calm under pressure. They'd be able to respond to situations thoughtfully rather than impulsively, and they recover from setbacks or emotional challenges much more quickly. All right, so now that we've talked about what emotion regulation is, let's talk about how it's connected to ADHD. So we know that ADHD very much impacts a person's ability to regulate their emotions. It makes it harder, meaning that person has a harder time responding to situations in a way that align with their values and beliefs because their emotions feel too big, too hard to control. Emotion regulation requires the use of specific executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are a set of mental skills, right? So strategies that a person uses to help them manage everyday tasks and set goals and achieve those goals. It's things like time management, organization, task initiation, right? Like actually getting started on things, being able to prioritize, being able to self-monitor, right? Being able to actually kind of assess how you're feeling. And one of the major executive functioning skills that has a very large role to play in emotion regulation is self-control, or another way to think about it is impulse control. And impulse control is the ability for us to think before we act. And so if someone with ADHD struggles with impulse control, but impulse control is necessary for us to be able to regulate our emotions, then we can start to see how the ability to manage your emotions, the ability to feel like you have control over your emotions, can feel significantly harder. So much of emotion regulation is being able to pause, being able to assess what you're feeling, how you're feeling, what triggered that feeling, and then determining what the best next step is from there, right? And impulse control is what allows us to do that, right? It allows us to think before we act. It allows us to actually be able to sit down with ourselves and tell ourselves, yes, I could go to a bar and numb my feelings, or I could go to a workout class, or I could call a friend, or I could go on a walk. So all these things require us to be able to be honest with ourselves about how we're feeling. And something I want to add is that no one is born with these skills, right? Everyone has to learn how to regulate their emotions. And there's so many studies that really speak to how important early childhood is in being able to regulate our emotions, and the way that our caregivers and our parents really influence the way that we experience our emotions and express our emotions. There's so much additional context here that I'm not even explaining, but for for the purposes of this conversation, what I want to add is that while emotion regulation is something that we all have to learn, regardless of whether or not we have ADHD, it is something that for people with ADHD, it is a very significant struggle because of the way that our brain is wired, because of the structure and the function of the brain. So something that's very important to keep in mind about ADHD and ADHD brains is that we produce less dopamine in our brain. And dopamine is an incredibly important neurotransmitter for helping us stay motivated, focused, and emotionally balanced. So when we have less dopamine production in our brains, it then becomes much more challenging to be able to stay focused, motivated, and emotionally balanced. That's often why we see Wellbutrin, for example, being prescribed for people with ADHD because of the way that it increases dopamine production in the brain. I also want to make sure that everyone is aware I am not a psychiatrist. I do not prescribe. This is not a substitution for actually speaking to a psychiatrist or doctor about medication, but other alternatives that also improve production of dopamine in the brain are things like Adderall, Vyvanse, Ritalin, right? So all of these are stimulants that help increase the amount of dopamine that our body and our brain is receiving. If you want to learn more about the really important role that dopamine plays in our lives and our ambition, I recommend this book right here. It is very, very interesting, and I definitely think that regardless of whether or not you have ADHD, it's something that you should check out. So when we don't produce enough dopamine, what ends up happening is our brains overreact to stress. Or it can feel like our brains are just constantly stuck in an endless loop of overpowering and overwhelming emotions. One way to think about it is to think of emotion regulation like a balance scale. So as an example of this, let's imagine that you are someone with ADHD and you are taking the SAT tomorrow. It's going to cause a lot of anxiety for everyone, regardless of, ADHD or not ADHD. However, the difference is that someone with ADHD is going to have a harder time balancing out their stress compared to someone without ADHD. And so we might see the person with ADHD unable to focus the night before the exam or unable to really kind of calm themselves down and do a self-care routine, right? Whereas someone without ADHD is going to potentially be better able to regulate their emotions the night before a really big exam. It's not to say that every person with ADHD or every person without ADHD is going to be able to regulate or not be able to regulate, right? It really will depend on the person. But the important thing to keep in mind is that because ADHD brains produce less dopamine, we then are less able to regulate our emotions, and that then causes consequences for the behaviors that we engage in. So it's not that people with ADHD are overly emotional. It's that our brains just process emotions differently, right? And so rather than kind of going down the shame spiral about how bad you feel about how you're responding to something, instead, I like to tell clients to get curious about what their emotions are telling them, really check in with themselves, learn how to slow down, and then recognize that just because your brain works differently doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your brain. You just need new strategies and new tools to be able to understand what your emotions are telling you. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to get really specific about what emotion dysregulation can look like so that we can think about how the strategies help us deal with the situations that I'm about to describe. So the first one is reacting without thinking. Imagine you send a text to your partner and you expect to hear back right away, but instead maybe it's crickets for hours and you start to get maybe a little paranoid, maybe a little anxious because normally they reply back really quickly. And so you start going down this spiral of they're no longer interested in me, they're distancing myself from me, they are more interested in whatever they're doing than they are with me. And emotion regulation, right, is the ability to pause, right? It doesn't mean you don't have those thoughts. You're able to actually be able to assess how accurate are these thoughts, is what I'm thinking actually the reality? And if they are not the reality, what can I do to calm myself down so that these thoughts don't feel like they're taking over me, right? So that these emotions don't feel like they're taking over me. The second example is struggling to calm down. So this can feel like a tidal wave of emotions has just hit you. And the challenge here is you may know that you're overreacting, right? You may know that your partner still loves you and is probably just busy, but because you have this tidal wave of emotions hitting you, you feel like you can't think straight, right? So logic goes out the window and you're operating solely on emotion here. Another way that emotion dysregulation can show up is emotions lasting longer than is comfortable. While others may be able to move on from a frustrating event more quickly, someone with ADHD may find themselves replaying this event in their head for hours or even days afterwards. And finally, one of the last things that I think is really interesting is that it's not just about regulating negative emotions. It's also about our ability to regulate positive emotions as well. You might get so excited about something that excitement, that joy, that passion might actually make it harder for you to focus on the things that you need to focus on and channel your energy in a way that you need to, right? So you may get really good news at 9 a.m., but you still have a whole day of work ahead of you. And emotion regulation is the ability to recognize that, yes, you're really happy. And even though you're tempted to kind of just blow off the day and just have fun and do something that feels good, you know that you have responsibilities, you know that you have to do things that you have to prioritize. And so you tell yourself, all right, once I do these things, once I get these things done on my list, then I'll go out and celebrate. That is one example of what emotion regulation can look like. And so with everything that I've just said, this lack of control that people with ADHD feel over their emotions is not just frustrating for them personally, but it also can very much impact their relationships. It can also impact their work, their mental health. When people decide they want to come to therapy, they very rarely say, I want to work on emotion regulation skills. Instead, they say things like, I feel sad all the time, or I feel irritable all the time. And so throughout treatment, what I'm doing is really helping people understand that the ability to control, manage, regulate our emotions is a skill, right? And just like with any skill that we learn, with the right tools, with the right strategies, with the right help, you can very much have a very different kind of relationship with your emotions. So now let's talk about some of the strategies that I tell clients and that I also use myself to regulate your emotions. All right, so tip number 1 is get in the habit of identifying what you're feeling. This can be in so many different ways, but it could be through journaling, it could be through therapy, it could be through creative expression, right? Songwriting, dance, guitar, right? Anything that allows you to kind of tap into what you're feeling and really get in tune with what your body is telling you. And whether we like it or not, a lot of us instinctually try to numb our emotions. Numbing our emotions is a form of emotion regulation. It's not a great way to cope with emotions, right? It's not a great way to regulate our emotions, but it is one way that we do it. Numbing our emotions can look like many different ways, right? It could be scrolling through social media. It could be going to a bar. It could be drugs. It could be work addiction. It could be shopping, right? There are lots of different ways to numb our emotions. What we have to get curious about is what is the function of you numbing your emotions? What are you trying to do, right? If you're going to a bar because you're trying to have fun and you're trying to hang out with friends, there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with going to a bar and enjoying time out with friends. There's nothing wrong with having an edible every once in a while, right? And being able to enjoy a different state of mind, personally. But if you're constantly leaning on things that ultimately make you feel worse in the long run, that's when I think therapy can be very helpful. Because your therapist can help you identify what it is that you're doing that is potentially making you feel worse, that you may not even realize is making you feel worse. And so this week, what I encourage you to do is take a very intentional step in being able to identify what you're feeling. So when something comes up, good or bad, take a moment and just ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? You don't have to fix anything with the emotion. You don't have to do anything with it. Just name it. Is it anxiety? Is it sadness? Is it frustration? Is it overwhelm? That ability to name it, that ability to accurately identify what it is that our body is making us feel is a huge step in being able to regulate our emotions. Okay. Tip number 2, regulate your emotions through your body. Emotions don't just live in your mind. They exist, they live in your body. And so using techniques to calm your physical state, right, to calm your body, to calm your central nervous system has huge consequences for your emotions. So anything that allows you to really kind of get in touch with how your body is feeling. So things like deep breathing, muscle relaxation, going to the gym, going on a run, all of those things can help you reset when you're feeling overwhelmed. The challenge is that when you feel overwhelmed, your first instinct isn't usually to do the thing that will help you feel less overwhelmed, right? Usually, especially if you're someone who's a little bit more prone to anxiety, which I totally am, your first instinct might be to spiral, right? And to kind of go down a spiral of really unhelpful thoughts that kind of just make you feel worse. So movement is essential. It is so important to be able to really just let the emotions move through your body and let yourself actually experience what it's like to regulate through movement. Okay, so now tip number 3. If you struggle to let yourself feel emotions, try making a feelings playlist. Music can be an incredibly powerful tool to process your emotions. That's why things like music therapy exists. Create a playlist specifically designed to help evoke very particular emotional states. So if there's a playlist that helps you feel sad when you feel sad, or a playlist that makes you feel happy when you feel happy, listening to music that resonates, that connects back to what you're feeling, can help you process the emotion more effectively or help you cope with it or manage it better when you are in a more calmed state. Okay, so the last tip is cognitive reappraisal. So to explain this one. Have you ever noticed how two people can go through the same exact situation, but feel completely different about it? That's because how we interpret or how we appraise a situation has a huge impact on how we feel about it. This process, right, the ability to appraise or interpret a situation and then determine how we feel about it, is called cognitive appraisal. And it's one of the most powerful tools for managing our emotions. It's how we evaluate a situation to determine its meaning. So for example, let's say you get a text from a friend that says, "We need to talk." If you appraise the situation, right, if you appraise this text as a sign that your friend is upset at you, you might feel anxious or worried, which makes a lot of sense. But if you appraise it as something neutral or something positive, like they just want to share good news, you might actually feel really calm and excited about reaching out to your friend. Our emotions often follow our thoughts. And so changing the way that we think about a situation can often change the way that we feel. And that's what makes cognitive appraisal such a powerful tool. It gives us control over our emotional responses by letting us reinterpret situations in a way that's less distressing and more constructive. So let's say you make a mistake at work and the first thing you think of is, "I'm the worst at this job, I'm gonna get fired." Naturally, right, this thought is gonna lead to feelings of shame and anxiety and stress. But if you pause and reframe it, right, if you reassess this mistake that you made at work, instead, what you could tell yourself is that mistakes happen. You are not the only or the first person to make a mistake, and it's an opportunity for you to grow and learn. And so the way that you talk to yourself makes a huge difference in how we feel. And it also makes a huge difference in how we carry ourselves through the world. If you're constantly telling yourself that, if you're constantly beating yourself up, if you're constantly just putting so much weight on your inner critic as opposed to paying attention to your strengths and the things that you're good at, then that inner critic is going to overpower all of the positive thoughts, right? So you're going to be paying so much more attention to the things that upset you, that cause anxiety, that cause stress, rather than the things that actually help you feel better. And a lot of the time it's because it becomes automatic, right? We don't even notice that we become so quick to criticize ourselves, to think negatively about a situation. And so one of the things that we then have to do is train ourselves to identify how we think about situations, how we feel about situations, and is there any room for changes in there? All right, so that was emotion regulation. I hope this was helpful. Leave a comment if you have any questions. I would love to talk more about this. There's so many more things I could say, but I'm trying to be concise. If you like this content, please feel free to subscribe. It would mean a lot to me, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.